May Allah's peace, mercy, and blessing be upon all of you. Secondly, I would like to thank our speakers for giving up their time and attending this event, especially Dr. Robert Stoffel, I hope I pronounced it right, for coming here at such a short notice. The topic of today's event is "Do Morals Require God?" So I would like to introduce our first speaker. His name is Dr. Robert Stoffel. Dr. Stoffel's childhood fascination for nature would later give rise to 3 degrees in the biological sciences, with research topics ranging from the earthy, the borrowing behavior of earthworms, to the profound why haven't things evolved to live forever. From his early doorstep encounters with Jehovah's Witnesses to his more recent discussions with Oxford professors of philosophy and theology, Dr. Stoffel is well placed to describe what happens when a scientist begins asking fundamental questions. Dr. Stoffel is a member of the National Secular Society, which campaigns against religious power-seeking and in favor of a level playing field for people of all faiths and none. So I would like to welcome him to come to the stage.
Do morals require God? Moses is a key figure in all 3 Abrahamic faiths. The Old Testament tells the story of how a God called Jehovah gave the 10 Commandments to Moses, but there are several problems with this story. Firstly, it's suspiciously similar to stories from neighbouring cultures that are much older. The Babylonians, for example, believed that a god called Shamash presented laws to a man called Hammurabi, and Hammurabi lived about 300 years before the time of Moses. Which story is true? I think neither. If we get our standards from God, from where did God get his standards? If God invented goodness, there must have been a time when God wasn't good. If God has always been good, he never invented the concept of goodness. If God defined goodness, it turns out that he's also responsible for defining evil, because good and evil, they're opposite sides of the same coin. It might be argued that evil is simply a lack of goodness and therefore not something defined by God. But if that's the case, inanimate objects like stones must be evil. After all, they can hardly be said to be good. It might be argued that although God's definitions make evil possible in principle, that potential for evil is only realised by other agents later on, when rebellious people or spirits freely choose to disobey God. But that doesn't actually get God off the hook as far as evil is concerned. If God is all-knowing, he knows what agents will freely choose to do. He created people knowing full well the evil that would result. And God therefore bears as much responsibility for the evil acts as the people who actually commit them. There's another problem with the alleged link between God and morality. Suppose I was quite a slow runner, but am now the fastest runner in the world. You'd probably admire me. After all, it takes a great deal of hard work to become able to run faster than anybody else. But if God has always been good, then his goodness was never acquired, never earned. Why worship a God who can't help but be good? As I understand it, the Quran, like the Bible, holds that human morality is fragile because people can be tempted to do the wrong thing. Well, although I favour a secular basis for ethics, I agree that morality is fragile. There are selfish and unselfish impulses within us, and morality is fragile because of the tension between these 2 elements. But it's this very tension that means that we deserve credit for doing the right thing. If we found it easy to do the right thing, why should we deserve credit for it? If God finds it easy to do the right thing, why should we give him credit for it? If, on the other hand, God finds it very difficult to do the right thing, that implies there's some kind of conflict within him, that God has selfish drives, albeit ones that never actually succeed in overpowering the unselfish drives. Yet I suspect this kind of conflict is not what most believers have in mind when they think of God. We'll now move on to a different question. What is it that makes an action good? Let's suppose that an action is good ultimately because God says it is, and something is bad ultimately because God says it is. Why is murder wrong? Well, ultimately because God said so. Why is stealing a pencil wrong? Well, ultimately because God said so. But hang on a minute. If murder is wrong because God said so, and stealing a pencil is wrong because God said so, and that's all there is to it, murder and stealing a pencil turn out to be wrong for exactly the same reason, which implies that one act is no worse than the other. There must be something more to morality than it's good because God said so. Otherwise, the statement, God is good, means only God is approved of by God. It conveys no useful meaning. We instinctively feel that murder is worse than stealing. Why might this be? Stolen money can be repaid, but the dead can't be brought back to life. But hang on a minute. If you're God, things can be brought back to life. Anything can be replaced without breaking into a sweat, merely by willing it to be so. It's difficult to see why, in God's eyes, things should have value at all. They're so easy to replace. Perhaps God's connection to morality is more practical. Okay, so God didn't actually invent goodness, but he does play a useful role in communicating to us which things are good and which things aren't. The problem with this idea should be obvious. There's disagreement both within and between religious traditions concerning what's right and what's wrong. In the Old Testament, God sanctions slavery, punishes people for the crimes committed by their ancestors, and raises an army against his own people in the knowledge that the women will be starved to such an extent that they'll be forced to eat their own children. Periods are sinful, and ladies, you must sacrifice 2 doves every time you have one. Even in the New Testament we read that a man who offers up his virgin daughters to be raped by a mob is righteous, that homosexuality is deserving of death, and that all unbelievers will be tortured forever in hell. Let's take a look now at the New Testament take on morality. James 2:10 implies that all laws are equally important. Whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. So it looks as though stealing a pencil really is as bad as murdering someone. In Matthew 23:23, Jesus muddies the waters by implying that while all laws are not equally important, they should all be kept. You give a tenth of your spices, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the former without neglecting the latter. But in Matthew 19:17-19, Jesus says only some commandments should be kept. When he's asked, he says, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony, honour your father and your mother, and love your neighbour as yourself. Jesus here omits love God, one of the 10 commandments, which Jesus elsewhere called the greatest commandment. In Mark's account of the same event, Jesus adds defraud not to the list, which isn't one of the 10 commandments, and omits love your neighbour as yourself, a command which we're elsewhere told sums up the entire law. The idea that you should treat your neighbour as you would like to be treated is called the Golden Rule, and it lies at the heart of most religions. It's not an infallible recipe for harmony, because different people have different tastes. However, it's still a very useful basis for ethics, because few people enjoy being the victims of violence, or being lied to, or being stolen from. The Christian formulation of the Golden Rule, though, love your neighbour as yourself, is problematic. as an agnostic called Robert Ingersoll pointed out, taste and love are not the servants of the will. One cannot be compelled to love. Perhaps God's connection to morality lies not so much in a generation of moral codes, but in their enforcement. This way of thinking holds that God is a kind of invisible security camera, the ultimate crime deterrent. But if you obey the law only because you're scared of being caught, the goodness that results from God's watching eye is not genuine. Arguably, it's not fear of God that exerts an influence, it's fear of his more fanatical followers. People mock Christianity today in a way in which they dare not mock Islam, despite the fact that there are many more Christians around than Muslims. I hope by now that you can see that the relationship between God and morality is problematic. But if God is not the source of our ethical standards, where do we get our ethical standards from? Some people believe that morals do require God. Many of them will probably agree with Jean-Paul Sartre's remark, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. Without God, all things may well be permitted, but that does not mean that all things are equally useful. To begin with a rather obvious example, there are, as far as I'm aware, no secular or even religious laws that mandate walking forwards or prohibit walking backwards. And yet we all tend to walk forwards for most of the time, even godless types like Richard Dawkins. The reason for this is pretty obvious. Regardless of your culture or religion, if you look backwards you can't see where you're going and you risk falling over. It's just not a useful thing for an organism to do. But what exactly do we mean by useful? Well, that depends on your environment. Gills are useful if you're a fish, but are of no use if you live on land. If you lived by yourself on a desert island, you'd have no need for morals. You couldn't do anything that was right and you couldn't do anything that was wrong. Morals are useful only because human beings are social animals. If you live in a group, it's important to be able to get along with other individuals. And no one likes being stolen to or assaulted or lied to. Any individual who did would be at a disadvantage compared to other individuals within the group. Morals, then, are useful adaptations for group life. Before Charles Darwin's time, the only explanation we had for the appearance of design in nature was that God did it. But Darwin offered a natural explanation for the origin of useful adaptation, evolution by natural selection. When you think about evolution, you probably think of changes in the bodies of animals, a fish crawling up onto land and over thousands of generations becoming amphibians, for example. But and that's probably because physical bodies fossilise, behaviour doesn't. Another example of a change would be sort of ape-like humans, ape-like animals evolving into people. We can see evidence for that in a fragmentary fossil record, but we have to infer behaviour. We can't study the behaviour of dead things, obviously. Behaviour, though, can be observed objectively in the laboratory. It is part of scientific study. Some behaviours are known to have a genetic basis, some are known to be learned. Some are a combination of the two. For example, the language that we learn is obviously determined by the language spoken by the people around us and not by our genes directly. However, the general capacity to speak and learn language is genetically hardwired. Deaf babies instinctively babble and experiment with speech, despite the fact they've never been able to hear anything. Evolution often gets a bad press from those who don't understand it, but biologists know that evolved behaviours don't have to result in selfish individuals. Slime moulds are remarkable organisms. When times are good, they wander around as individual amoeba-like cells. When times are harsh, their behaviour changes completely. They coalesce to form a multicellular organism that looks a bit like a slug, and their cells cooperate in a very intimate way to bring this about. Going into the general election, Nick Clegg and David Cameron were sworn enemies who found it useful to stress what divided them. Within the politically harsh climate of a hung parliament, they needed one another and found it useful to get along. Politicians plan for the future and slime-molds don't, but that fact is irrelevant to the point I want to make here, namely that cooperation can be useful in some environments. It's therefore something we can expect evolution to favour sometimes, without recourse to any holy text. To give a simple example of unselfish behaviour, parents, particularly mothers, give resources to their offspring instead of keeping the resources for themselves. Why do they do that? Because a parent's unselfish behaviour generates the copies of the genes that live in its offspring. By being nice to its offspring, a gene will usually be being nice to itself, or at least to an identical copy of itself. It's selfish behaviour then from the gene's point of view, and that's what matters in evolution, but it's not selfish from the point of view of the individual. There are all kinds of life histories you can make sense of by reference to selfish genes. My favourite example is something called the Thrips egg mite. The male mates with its sisters while it's still inside its mother and dies before it's born. The mother is eaten alive from the inside by her own daughters and dies when she's 4 days old. All things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. Worker bees are more closely related to their own sisters than they would be to their own offspring, and this genetic quirk explains why they're willing to die in defense of their hive. They're nature's original suicide bombers, and again had no holy text to guide them. Evolution can favour cooperation even between unrelated individuals. Chimpanzees exhibit what's known as reciprocal altruism. They have a cooperative rule called you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But if evolution can produce such unselfish behaviour, why do we still see selfishness? Cheating can be adaptive for an individual in the short term, provided it's not found out, because stealing something can be easier than earning it fairly. You scratched my back, great. Now I'll save my time and energy by not scratching yours. Once individuals are being exploited by cheats, though, we might expect individuals to evolve ways of dealing with them. No one likes being taken for a ride, and more to the point, it's not useful to be taken for a ride. Accordingly, chimpanzees detect cheats and then punish them. I scratched your back, you didn't scratch mine, so I'm not going to bother scratching your back again. And when other members of the group hear about this, they won't bother scratching your back either. These kinds of rules are only possible among intelligent animals living in small, stable groups over a long period of time. And they've been observed in birds, wolves, dolphins, monkeys, apes, and of course, people. Reciprocal altruism is reliant upon the fact that all members of a society can see and identify one another as individuals. If chimpanzees were to don burqas, it's a pretty good bet that this system would break down. There's another mechanism underlying morality which I haven't mentioned yet, the ability to empathise. Human beings live in groups. Wouldn't it be useful to be able to read another person's mind and work out what they're up to? You could use that knowledge to help them, or you could use it to outcompete them. Either way, it's a very useful thing to be able to do. Human beings can't read minds, of course, but they do have a sense of empathy. We can put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and so imagine what that person might be feeling. The ability to empathise, whether it evolved for selfish reasons or unselfish ones, has a very important consequence. If we hurt other people, we can't help but identify with them to a degree, and we are, in a sense, hurting a part of ourselves. Empathy acts as a natural break to selfish or aggressive behaviour. It's only a very short step from think of your neighbour as yourself to treat your neighbour as yourself. Because once we empathise with other people, we feel awkward about treating them badly. The idea that other people are like us is simple. Once we start assuming that people are different, this raises all kinds of additional questions. In what way do they differ? By how much do they differ? Why do they differ? And so on. Human societies enforce man-made rules through the use of the police and the legal system. Contrary to what some religionists say, it's not necessary to believe in God in order to live a moral life. As I said earlier, at the heart of all religions is the golden rule. Treat your neighbour as yourself. But that rule is secular. It makes no mention to God whatsoever. I therefore encourage you to think carefully for yourselves about what's right and wrong, to rely on shared human values of reason, evidence and compassion in this changing world, and not to rely on divisive, static religious traditions. Thank you.
Now I would like to welcome Brother Abdullah Abdul-Yusir. Abdullah is a former Christian of Portuguese descent who embraced Islam at a young age and has studied Islam in depth since he was 18. He also has an academic background in computer sciences. Abdullah has had a long experience in working for Islamic intellectual revival and the establishment of Islamic Sharia in the Muslim world. His activities involve speaking at community centers, universities, colleges, and appearances on various TV programs. He is also experienced in debating and has debated extensively with atheists, secularists, and Christians on a variety of platforms, including public TV and radio. He is currently a member of the Muslim Debate Initiative, a public discussion forum that promotes open dialogue and debate. Please welcome Brother Abdullah.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salamu ala Nabi Kareem Muhammad wa ala alihi at-tayyibin wa sahbihi at-tahirin. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. And I brought a laptop. I don't usually give talks with a laptop. I usually give talks with nice paper. But people thought I was back in the Stone Age, and I think I should modernize how I give talks. So I bought a laptop. And now I have to squint as I read from this very small screen, so please forgive me if I make funny eye movements while I'm looking at my monitor. I'd like to thank first the Southampton Islamic Society and the Atheist Society for hosting this interesting debate. I'd also like to thank Dr. Robert Storvod for attending and giving us what was no doubt a good enunciation for the case for morality without God. Now, I'd like to begin with asking a question, can atheists be moral? If anyone came in today thinking I would be claiming that atheists, especially Western atheists, are immoral or self-centered, egotistical and self-interested, then I'm afraid I'll have to disappoint you. I'm not here today to demonstrate that atheists can't be moral. I'm here to demonstrate that they have no intellectual foundation to be. Or at the very least, they don't have an acceptable or consistent set of morals. And I'll explain why, near the end of my presentation, the very reason why atheists with morals do exist. First, let's discuss what morals are. Morals do not relate to actions. Morals relate to the value behind an action or an intention. So doing an action, for example, giving money to the poor, is not moral. It's a moral action. It's an action that has value. Let's take another example, and obviously I like to say that all values are determined based on a set of criteria. So for example, if you view giving money to the poor as something which is valuable, then it becomes your moral. That's the moral that you hold. And it's very much like a central bank of a country. In a central bank of a country, they print out paper money. The paper money has no intrinsic value except just a kind of rectangle piece of paper with some printing on it. It has no intrinsic value to it. What gives it the value is that the bank is willing to transfer anyone that comes to it and pay the bearer the sum of £5 or £10 whatever that means in today's fiat system, but certainly back in the old days it used to mean they give you gold. And so people used to take money as having some value. You go to the shops, you have confidence that the shopkeeper also values that money as you value that money. And so it gains currency, and that's why we call it currency. Now, continuing this, the economic example, what do you think has really intrinsic value? Paper money or gold coins? Obviously, it would be the gold coins. Gold coins have an intrinsic value, and paper money is just based on confidence. It's actually one of the biggest confidence scams ever in every country, where they print out paper money, and we all have confidence in this paper money, until, of course, you have rapid inflation, which obviously is destroying Zimbabwe. It destroyed the economy of Argentina and many countries which collapsed due to high inflation because paper money has no intrinsic value. It's up to you to believe in that value. In a way, it's like a noble lie. You have to believe this lie for it to have value. And this is very interesting, because I'm going to now relate this to the issue of morals. You see, if you don't believe in anything of any moral that has intrinsic value, a demonstrable intrinsic value, then essentially when you're taking something to be moral, you're taking it based on trust, on confidence. You're confident that what your parents told you is moral, and you will blindly follow this moral. And it's the same thing for money. And you'll be surprised how many societies have based their economies on such typical confidence scams. And well, I would argue that secular morality is also a confidence scam, but I'll go into why. So what is the possible basis for morals? How do we base our morals? What is a good way of basing our morals? Well, let's discuss the different bases there are. Let's discuss, let's say, an evolutionary or genetic basis. Michael Ruse, a philosopher of science from the University of Guelph in Canada, writes, the position of modern evolutionists is that humans have an awareness of morality, because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation no less than your hands, your feet, your teeth. And he continues, I appreciate it that when someone says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just aid to survival and reproduction. Any deeper meaning is illusory. But now let's say, okay, for example, let's use evolution now as the basis for our morality. Fine, cooperating, being a team player is helpful. But what if you are a very strong team player? What if you can dominate others? What if you can get loads of mates for yourself, assuming you're the alpha male of a pack of human beings? Shouldn't your genetic genes have more right to be reproduced with as many females as possible, and the weaker males don't have this right because you are stronger, you're more intelligent, you're what have you, you have more resources, whatever the case might be. The strong deserve to survive and the weak deserve to die off or not reproduce. Nietzsche, the philosopher Nietzsche despised religion, and he's a very famous atheist philosopher. Everyone knows Nietzsche. He despised religion because he said it makes us help the weak and it restricts the strong. He condemned Christianity as a slave morality. You see, why should we help the weak? And why should the strong have to restrict themselves and limit themselves to pull the dead weight? This is what Nietzsche said. And he came out this very open, because this is the reality of when you reject God and you reject these religions, which make you care for the weak. It's counter-evolutionary. People might say, maybe my emotions are the result of my genes. Me wanting to help someone and be altruistic, my genes make me do that. Oh, and that's totally fine, that's really great. But what if you are a mass murdering psychopath? You could argue, my genes made me do so as well. And because genes determine morality, it's just as good as a person who helps other people. Maybe the mass murdering psychopath gets to eliminate all his competing male rivals and gets to mate with as many women as possible because he is the strongest guy. In genetically speaking, what he's doing is moral, according to that basis. So remember, humans have a good side, we've also got a bad side. And if you're saying that whatever comes from a human being is intrinsically moral, then both sides are intrinsically moral too. Funnily enough, this would cause what I call the determinist negation of moral agency. Bit of a long double-barrel sentence. Basically, if there's no soul, there's no free will. What made you do something is a combination of your genes and the situation, the context you're in, including what you're taught and the environment you're in. In that situation, you are not morally culpable for anything you do because it wasn't you. There is no intrinsic you. It's just the result of your ancestors' genes making you do it, and the context which you were born into made you do the actions you did. Something like a good excuse for a wife beater. Say, look what you made me do. Blaming the wife because the wife acting that way, the husband had to beat her because that was his genetic disposition. Again, if you want to go by that, then no one is culpable, no one is guilty. We're just mechanisms in a great big machine in this universe that just does things. What about social imitation? That's a basis for morality. Richard Taylor, an eminent ethicist, said that contemporary rights and ethics who obliquely discourse upon moral right and wrong and moral obligation without any reference to religion are really just weaving intellectual webs from thin air, which amount to saying that they discourse without meaning. If social imitation, whatever society is doing, you do it. Most people, religious and atheist, learn their morals through social imitation. That is the biggest teacher of morals. You know, monkey see, monkey do, essentially. And this is because a lot of us follow what society has taught us blindly, that we have a lot of morals. Just because our parents hit us when we did something wrong, or we hit our sister, or was mean to whoever, our parents chastised us by some way, a shape or form, that we thought, okay, that was wrong, and we did something and we got rewarded, that was right. It was pain associated. Pain and pleasure association, conditioning, gave us our morality. And that is ephemeral. It's just a matter of how you were conditioned. Literally how you were brainwashed when you were young to view your tastes. Again, has no basis. The other basis for morality could be the enlightened self-interest, as people like to call it, or the social contract. It's very interesting. The humanist philosopher Paul Kurtz says, the central question about morality and ethical principles concerns this ontological foundation. If they are neither derived from God nor anchored in some transcendent ground, are they purely ephemeral? Basically, you could, if you're allying with someone for a certain contract or a certain reason, and as long as your interest is being fulfilled, you will be in that contract. You'll be in that social contract with society. But what if your interests are not being fulfilled? What if you're a member of society and you're downtrodden, you're poor, society isn't helping you, or you try to get ahead and everyone else is getting ahead, or other people, or the alpha males are just abusing the system? What do you do then? What do you do? Then you say, oh, forget this. Yeah, forget this contract, it's not working for me. Because self-interest changes. Sometimes it's not always in your interest to stay with a contract. Sometimes you should break the contract if your self-interest is your primary goal. Again, it's not a basis. People can break their contracts. Self-interest is very whimsical. What about the basis of mutual happiness? Let's do things to bring mutual happiness. Well, again, that has no basis for the human context. Humans are essentially egoists. We experience life only as individuals. We don't experience life as a collective. Why should we help other people to get happy if it costs our happiness? For example, people might say, okay, look, maybe we can all live together, and as long as we don't hurt each other physically, that's okay. All right, fine. Let's consider this. Let's say you're in a marriage. You don't like your wife, or you don't like your husband. And there is another mate available, and he or she likes you, and there's an opportunity for you to engage with that mate in a physical relationship. You can commit adultery. If your partner finds out, it will hurt them. It won't hurt them physically. You haven't hurt them physically, but you've hurt them emotionally. You've prioritized your happiness because eventually, if your only criteria is what makes you happy, then that's the only thing you can look at, over the happiness of other people. And people say, but if I prioritize that other person's happiness, then I'll be miserable. So what do you choose? That's a problem, which again the mutual happiness basis doesn't give you any solutions for. What about, and this was quoted by Dr. Raymond Tellis, very esteemed friend that I know. He said that equality, he said that the reason why I'm moral to all my fellow human beings is because we are all intrinsically equal. He believes in a transcendental equality between human beings. It's interesting, an atheist is using the word transcendental, but the political philosopher, Louis Hodgman, notes, if we were to accept the empirical reality of people and their differences, there should be a presumption of inequality rather than the presumption of equality, upon which so many political philosophers depend. We are equal, it is almost sure, in the sense of being before God, since we are in fact equal in virtually no other way. There is nothing about us that is equal to another human being, with the possible exception of an arbitrary definition of what is a race, what is a particular racial group of species. Apart from this, we differ in intelligence, we differ in strength, we differ in skin color, and size, and shape, and bone mass, and all kinds of numerous ways. So how are we all equal? What is intrinsic about us equal? If you say, oh, but we're all human, doesn't that make us equal? Just because we possess a similarity, does that make us equal? So I'm made out of organic compounds, like this desk here. So this desk is made out of wood. I'm made out of organic compounds. This is made out of organic compounds. Does it mean that I'm equal with this desk? Just because we have one similarity? It's arbitrary. You want to pick something that will fit it, but again, there's nothing equal about us if you consider the scientific reality of different human beings. So, the only other basis is what I call conservatism, which is arbitrary morals that are taught by imitation and enforcement. Again, that's similar to social imitation, which is basically in a society, they have a culture. This culture is preserved for thousands of years, and everyone born into that culture is taught the morals which were preserved by the many ancestors and passed down. What Richard Dawkins likes to call memes. Now, in that situation, which most human beings traditionally have always followed, this cultural morality that's been passed down to them, this has only been the only effective way that human beings have actually preserved morality in an unchanging form. Of course, every culture that has done this has had to use either a religious or some kind of metaphysical basis to do so, whether it be karma, Taoism, or the Abrahamic faiths, or what have you, or various pagan or idolatry. They've had to use some metaphysical basis to justify why you should behave according to morals that this society follows. And that's a sociological fact throughout history. It's always been like this. Now, what did the great philosophers think? What did they think? Forget about me, I'm not a great philosopher, nor do I pretend to be. But what did the great philosophers think? Well, let's say Hume. You know what Hume, he's a great atheist philosopher. What did he say? Morals are just tastes. What you feel, what your likes and dislikes, that's your morality. He's being very honest, Hume. Immanuel Kant, very interesting. Immanuel Kant, he critiqued obviously reason as a basis to derive, I guess, morality only just using pure reason and an observation of the universe. We can come to some kind of deduction of what is morals. He had to put into his beliefs, he had to put in the concept of God, because God is the only absolute basis that will give legitimacy to any moral system. And this was Immanuel Kant had to do this. I think he called it the super sensible being. He called it God. Nietzsche obviously was very much more abrupt and very straight to the point. He said, without God, there's no morality. And he was famous for mourning the death of God, because he was one of the famous philosophers that said that God is dead, he said. So he mourned the death of God and said that now that the human beings have to embrace some kind of terrible destiny without any kind of basis for why we are moral and so on. So this was Nietzsche, very open and very straight to the point to what the actual issues are. So that's the case. There is no basis. There's no basis for the political moralities. I want to give a side point. I'm going to use 2 minutes of this, of what happens when societies apply a materialistic basis and they say, right, we're going to order society according to this materialistic basis. What happens? Well, obviously the political philosopher John Rawls calls people like this political perfectionists. Sometimes they're called extremists in the current vernacular. An example of this, let's say, if you believe that morals are determined by genetics, this can lead to social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was essentially that the strong should prevail, the weak should be gotten rid of. The Nazis were very much for social Darwinism, and very interestingly enough, in the 1930s, Churchill was also for this. He spoke about sterilizing the feeble-minded imbeciles, what he calls imbeciles, and also the weak-minded. They should be sterilized because they shouldn't be allowed to reproduce. They are weakening the genetic pool of the nation. Very interesting. Churchill and Nazis share something in common: social Darwinism. Utilitarianism, which I'm not going to go into too much detail, which is basically that you should get the maximum pleasure or happiness to the maximum amount of people. Unfortunately, because you should look at the bigger picture, this force should look at the bigger picture, they were allowed to do a little evil to do a lot of good. So for example, Mill and Bentham, John Stuart Mill and Bentham, these are the famous utilitarians, they justified colonization and repression of quote-unquote barbarians, because in the long run, it's for their own good. So fine, you can torture them, you can massacre them, you can kill the civilians, because in the long run, it's for their own good. That's where we get colonialism from. Colonialism isn't an aberration of Western history, it's part of the Western ideology. Utilitarianism still continues to this very day, war in Iraq and all that stuff. The social contract, when applied in France, for example, they had the reign of terror, which under Robespierre, where everyone must conform to what the state defines is the model citizen. And of course, the state has no moral authority, and so they had to apply by a reign of terror, by fear, very Machiavellian. Now, why has not a lot of these things happened in England? I'll answer very quickly on this. England has always had that kind of duality. It's had the leftists, these political perfectionists on one scale, and it's had the conservatives on the other scale. And the conservatives believe in morals which was bequeathed to them by their Christian past. And so it kind of pulled Britain from not going into extremism, like other countries have went into extremism. Now, how does God give us morals? God is an absolute and transcendent basis that values our actions. So God is infinite, eternal. If God, think of him, going back to the kind of Bank of England example, God values the actions we do, and He is not a temporary thing. He is an eternal, permanent thing. He is an absolute basis to reset our criteria for what is morality. God provides an intellectual narrative upon which to judge our actions as to whether or not they are fulfilling our ultimate objective. For example, when the Quran says, I have not created man or jinn except to worship me. When God says this, it's our purpose. Anything that is suiting our purpose is good. Anything that goes against our purpose is bad. Much like if you had a car, if the car doesn't work, it's a bad car. If the car works and gets you from A to B, it's a good car because it fulfills the purpose. Hence, God gives us purpose and we can judge things. And of course, God gives us a morality of the ultimate enlightened self-interest, where we are offered in the hereafter the rewards and the punishments for those people who are of that nature. And the beautiful thing about this is securing your reward in the hereafter will not impinge upon the reward that other people will get. Unlike in this society, the more resources you get, the less other people will get. This is what God can offer us. So why do they exist moral atheists? Atheists who are moral. Easy, social imitation. They imitate the society they're in. They were born in society, they weren't told this. Blind adoption, the second point, blind adoption of morality from previous generations. Western society is built on Christianity. Was built on Christianity. Christianity had the concept of a soul, which gives you moral agency. You are now morally culpable because your soul has free will, therefore you are at fault if you commit a crime. Also, because all souls are equal before God, we have equality. And of course, the humanists and the libertarians borrowed these Christian concepts and brought them into the modern era, building an elaborate system around a very Christian core. And of course, why a moral basis matters is because people, Christian atheists who have not been conditioned to be moral, how are we going to, if a person's rich, and he's very selfish and self-centered, and he has lots of money, and he's enjoying his resources, and he's getting loads of them, how do you tell that person to be more moral? There is no benefit in it for them to be moral if an atheist has been brought up with this disposition of a selfish rich person, for example. How do you change that person? How do you get a person off of alcohol if they are, of binge drinking or whatever? How do you get that person? They enjoy it. How do you get it off? How do you get them off them? There is no basis to get it off them except an appeal to the metaphysical, which they deny. Anyway, that ends my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Okay, well, a number of points were made there. One of them that atheists have no consistent set of morals. Now, it's quite true to say that atheists, there are disagreements among atheists on how to behave, but then there are disagreements between them within religious traditions as well, as I've said. People do tend to agree on the basics. You know, practically all atheists will say that lying is wrong, that murder is wrong, that stealing is wrong. Just about everyone is agreed on the basics, and there are very obvious reasons for that. It's simply not useful for an organism to like being cheated against or lied to. So you can justify why you can expect a consistent set of morals, because these things are useful in all societies. Now, we spoke about the values we give to something. Let's look at languages. Now, a word has no objective value. Its meaning varies from one language to another. It's a bit like currency, really. A currency that's useful in one country could be useless in another one. But language is useful provided everybody agrees on it. But we're not going to, would you argue from that language must come from God, or that a particular language is right? The idea that was raised that gold coins have got intrinsic value. Well, if you're on a desert island and there's a ship in the distance, but you're starving, and I set before you some gold coins or some food, which has more value? The idea that gold coins are intrinsically, in this society, gold coins are worth a lot more than a bit of food, because you can buy lots of food with gold coins. On a desert island, if you haven't got a choice, you can't buy food. If I gave you a choice between some food and some gold coins, which you could do absolutely nothing with, you would choose the food. Gold coins would be worthless. So this idea of intrinsic value is just blown out of the water by the desert island analogy. Again, it shows how the utility of something varies according to the environment you're in. The idea of intrinsic value falls down, I think. It doesn't survive scrutiny. The claim was made that caring for the weak is counter-revolutionary. Why is it that then that male balloons will bring up the rear of the troop and defend elderly and sick relatives, or sick members of the troop, not necessarily close relatives actually, against predators? Non-human primates will stick their necks out to defend weaker members of their own group. It happens. Being able to sense what other individuals feel is a useful thing in evolutionary terms. And once you have that ability, as I say, it acts as a natural brake to selfish behaviour. There's also a possible mechanism whereby a male is basically saying to females, hey, look how fit I am, I can afford to go and save all these weak members of the troop, that's how strong I am. So that would be an example of a male sort of demonstrating his fitness by doing very brave things. So again, you see the idea that it's easy always to spot good behaviour and selfish behaviour. I think maybe a bit more complex than we think. The point was made that if there's no soul, there's no such thing as free will. Well, if there is free will, there is no necessary connection between a person's past experiences and a person's environment, their past experiences, and their consequent behaviour. So free will weakens the idea that behaviour is determined by anything. If you have a code of ethics and you believe in free will, you've weakened the idea that that code of ethics determines how people will behave. The more deterministic you think the world is, then the more influence any code of ethics is likely to have. It was asked, why should we help others to get happy if it costs us happiness? But it certainly doesn't always have to cost us happiness. Most people are happy if they see that they're making other people happy. Most people feel sad if they know they've done something that makes other people sad. We are generally happy when other people are happy as well. The happiness, my happiness and other people's happiness don't have to be mutually exclusive. They're very often tied together. We spoke also about the idea that the idea we're all intrinsically equal. That's flawed. Well, obviously we're not all perfectly equal. So it was suggested that we should presume inequality rather than presume equality. The problem with presuming inequality is it's utterly useless unless you can say in what way people are unequal. If I say two people are on the same height, that's no use unless I can say by how much taller one person is than the other one. It's very complicated. For purely practical reasons, it doesn't make sense to presume inequality because you have to go and say something about how people are unequal. For purely practical reasons, it makes sense to presume equality. It's a basic simplifying assumption. And you said there's nothing equal about us if you look at the scientific basis of humanity. If individuals were very different, they would not be able to interbreed with one another. Members of the same species, because they share genes, are by their very nature similar. Biologists define things as different species if they're so separate that they can't interbreed. So there's a firm scientific basis, and we see that even in races that look very different, all different races can interbreed. We're all variations on the same theme. So there is a biological basis for the similarity that underlies all human beings, and I think for the ethical codes that are common to all human societies. It was said that religion offered a basis for morality, but as I said earlier, love your neighbour as yourself is a secular rule. It makes no reference to God. Now you can say that perhaps no one would have believed it had it not been for religious figures. Perhaps religion gives you a reason to believe something, but it's not the same as saying that it actually generates the code. A problem with religion is that it does give people strong reasons to believe things, but that unfortunately works for behaviours that you and I will both condemn as immoral. It works for those as well as the moral ones. It's a double-edged sword. Buddhism is a non-theistic religion, and the Buddha, despite the fact he said he didn't want to be worshipped, some of his followers went off and worshipped him, but he reassessed his life because allegedly he was born into a very wealthy environment, pampered, a very rich environment, and when he came out of that and looked at how different the lives of everybody else were, he was shocked by that. And to me there's nothing sort of transcendental about that. Again, it comes down to, well, he just saw how other people were behaving and was able to empathise with them. He saw a different environment, that changed his perspective, perfectly down to earth. Confucius was a philosopher who advocated the golden rule again, without any reference to religion. Hume's idea that morals are just tastes, well, I don't think they are just tastes, they're useful tastes. In the same way that liking water is a taste, it's a useful taste. If you don't like water, or if you don't like drinking, you're going to die of thirst, you're going to die. The idea that something is if something's a taste, that doesn't have to demean it. It can still be a useful taste, a useful thing. So I question the idea that just tastes. Social Darwinism was mentioned. That's actually based on a misunderstanding of Darwinism. We now know that traits like empathy are very useful The idea that in the long term the ends justify the means, you know, let's kill off the weak for the good of the race, and so on. Well, what does God say? Let's have lots of evil in this world. It's necessary so that people can freely choose to be good. That's the argument by and large religious people use to justify the existence of suffering. So they would see that evil people are being used by God as a means to a greater end. God would appear to use evil as well. Whereas the basis of humanist ethics is that people should always be treated as an end in themselves and never wholly as a means to an end. Okay? Thanks.
All right, I'm going to respond to what he said in his presentation, and then in my next rebuttal, I'll respond to what his rebuttal was, so that we can have some continuity here, so I can try and get all his points. In his presentation, he said that, you know, where did God get goodness? Does goodness predate God, and so on? How do you define goodness? Well, essentially, as you said with one of your points, that God defines what is good by his commands. Good is defined as essentially that which agrees with God's will, and that which doesn't agree with God's will is not good. Now he said that he basically called why did God, you know, create evil or allow evil if he's essentially good or what have you. And you missed the point. You see, the point of this existence is not for us to enjoy ourselves, and the Christian assumptions of theology essentially God is all loving, and God is being all loving will never want anything bad happening to us. He wants us always to enjoy ourselves and be happy and so on. Obviously, if you believe that, the Christian narrative, then of course you're going to see a problem with the existence of evil. Whereas for Muslims and so on, the existence of what you call good and evil is neither here nor there. All that we see is our purpose, which our purpose is to follow the will of God. Just because other people don't follow the will of God doesn't mean that we have to not follow the will of God. And in fact, the more there is a test, and if we overcome this test, we get rewarded even more. So in fact, the presence of evil is an opportunity for us to overcome that and get even more good because there was the evil. If no one was starving in the world, where will the good come from, or feeding anyone if no one's starving in the world? I believe they call it second order good, as the philosophers say. In some cases, obviously, we are given free will. One could argue that in a kind of parent-child relationship, although I wouldn't use it the same way the Christians do, that sometimes the parent has to allow the child to experience the world for himself, sometimes to hurt themselves playing or whatever, and for them to learn. Sometimes the best way to learn is the hard way. It would perhaps be irresponsible of the parent to wrap up their child in bubble wrap and never let them out of the house, and then you do more damage to that child. He says, is murder and stealing a pencil equal because God says so? Again, I think you're basing a lot of it on Christian theology. I'll say this: God values actions. He doesn't value all actions the same, or all disobedience the same. Some disobedience is worse than others, determined by God depending on what you've actually done. So for example, if God gives value to human life, God gives value to human life. If you take away human life, then you have committed a very big offense, a very big sin. God gives value to ownership of property, but not as much. An item, an object, does not have as much value as a living being. And hence, if you were to steal an object, it is not the same degree of crime. I think that should be very obvious to anyone that thinks about that. He said that people disdaining from actions because God is watching. How is that morality? If you say, I'm going to do that because I'm going to get punished. Well, again, even in Islam, the highest form of goodness is to do things purely out of love of God, and there are different levels of what motivates you. But that aside, it's one thing to do not to do an action because you see the punishment in front of you. You see the cameras, the CCTV cameras, you see the policeman, you see the guillotine, whatever. You see the punishment in front of you. Okay, I'm not going to do that. That's one thing. The other thing is to disdain from doing something out of fear of something you haven't seen before in your life. That when you do an evil act, there is no punishment forthcoming straight after the evil act. People who do evil acts and get the benefit from those evil acts, you don't see the punishment forthcoming for that. There is such a temptation to do the evil act because you don't see punishment. And remember, out of sight, out of mind. So So trying to keep what is essentially an abstract idea, the concept of God, in your mind is actually very difficult. And hence, that is the value derived from disdaining from doing a bad evil act, because you believe in this idea that you haven't seen directly. He said that people mock Christianity more than Islam as a side point. Well, that's because you've had many wars, bloody wars between Christians and humanists and what have you. And so, essentially, you've now disdained Christianity, you've debunked it, and now people, it's okay to attack Christianity. I have no problem with people criticizing Islam for intellectual purposes. Islam has no problem with people criticizing Islam. We had, for 1,200 years, wonderful debates between atheists, Jews, Christians, some of them writing very strong-worded language against Prophet Muhammad and Islam from within the Islamic State in Baghdad and Cordoba and so on, and no one was against them. So again, that was perhaps a side point which is not for this debate. He said that utility is a basis for morals. He said that in a group, morals are important. Yes, but you see, what if you're a dictator? Then morals aren't so important, because you now have control of the group. And they have to follow, they have to dance to your tune. Whereas all you now have to look out for is people who are a challenge to your power. And you have to deal with those people who are a challenge to your power by execution, torture, what have you, much like dictators do, very Machiavellian. And so, just being part of a group doesn't mean you're going to be moral. Sometimes you have an advantage which you'll use for your own advantage against others. He also said that behaviors have a genetic basis. Again, I really debunked that. So what? Then I could say cheating has a genetic basis, killing has a genetic basis. You're not really saying anything. So people cooperate for self-interest, and he talked about apes and so on. They would help the weaker members of their thing. And so yeah, okay, let's look at nature. Rats, when resources are scarce, will eat their babies. Even some poor human beings in the history of mankind have done the same. They didn't eat their children, but they buried their children alive, or they killed them because they were poor and they didn't think that they could survive. And then when the Quran came down to these people in Arabia, it said, do not kill your children for fear of want, God will provide. You have to have faith that God you haven't seen will provide for you and your starving child, whereas what you would have done before that, if you didn't know about this promise, would have been you would have killed your child. So Islam had to come down and prevent that from happening by giving people faith in something they couldn't see. Something atheists would think would be absurd if you want to make all the calculus, the materialistic calculus. He said that, again, animals will turn on each other when the resources are scarce. There are so many examples, I'm not going to cite one. People cheat if it's okay and they can hide it. But obviously, in a closed group, animals will notice if they're being cheated against. Yeah, but in a big urbanized city, who's going to notice? People can steal from supermarkets and shops, and it's a victimless crime because no one's actually hurt. If you can get away with it, it's not a crime. I said that if chimpanzees were to don burqas, this system of reciprocal altruism will break down. Little dig there. Well, I bet if chimpanzees don metal studs, punk hair, drag outfits and hoodies, the system would break down too. So again, that's neither here nor there, little small dig in this debate. I also want to make a point, I like to see how burqas would affect morals or bats, which don't rely on visual sensory stimuli. You also said, treat people as you would treat yourself. Well, I'll tell you this, if I was a self-interested man with no morals, I would like to sexually harass maybe women. Why? Because I would love them to sexually harass me. I love that. Treat people as you'd have yourself treated. I would love women to come to form queues and harass me and take me out and whatever. I love that. Please do it. If I was obviously not a Muslim and a self-interested individual. Of course. But women don't like that, but men do. So your axiom doesn't work. Sometimes people don't want to be treated as you yourself want to be treated. So it doesn't work. The other point which he mentioned, if I've got about a minute left, I'll start on the rebuttal ones. He said all atheists agree that murder is wrong. Okay, so what do you do with dictators and tyrants who torture their people, who kill people? What do you do with murderers? What do you do with them then? People that habitually murder, even if you lock them in prison, they will kill all the prison mates. What would you do with these people? Either you give isolation, or in some cases, in terms of dictators, you go to war. So you justify killing. So not all atheists agree that killing in all circumstances is wrong. In fact, in some cases, using utilitarian calculus, which Bentham and Mill did, colonialism, killing people for their own good, for the greater good, can be justified, according to a materialistic mathematical calculus of utilitarianism. It was applied to colonialism. He said that the language does not have an absolute basis. I say it does. It has a holy book. Language has a holy book. Each language, you know what it's called? A dictionary. Thank you.
Okay, we've said that God defines goodness by his commands. But if that's true, if something is good simply because God defines it, then murder would be good if God said so, slavery would be good, anything would be good. It all becomes completely arbitrary. And the arguments are used about murder being worse than stealing pencils, or being no worse than stealing pencils. It has nothing to do with Christian theology. It doesn't mention Christian God. It mentions God, but it was actually derived from Plato, who believed in God and lived before the time of Christians. So it wasn't derived from Christian theology at all. It was said that our purpose is to follow the will of God. How do we know if something's been well designed? We know it's been well designed if it fulfills its purpose. The fact that, according to Islam and just about every other religion, people are very good at turning away from the one true religion and embracing other faiths, means we weren't well designed. If we apply the same criteria of detecting design to God as we do to human beings, a product that failed more times than it worked, we would consider to be poorly designed. By those standards, then, the human race is poorly designed and God is a poor designer. You can't use the design analogy when it suits you and stop using it when it doesn't. The argument, well, I'd like to be ravished by women, so why don't I go around ravishing women? We need to elaborate that then. I'd like to be ravished by beautiful women who were very happy about having sex with me. I don't want to be ravished by ugly women who don't really want to be there. I want to be ravished by beautiful women who really freely want to have sex with me. Now, if I go around ravishing women who think I'm beautiful, and if we both freely want to have sex, there's no problem with that at all. Everyone's happy. Fantastic. So, there's no problem with that rule. But the idea I'd like to be ravished by women, you need to sort of pan it out a bit and make explicit more, what kind of women. And are these women happy doing what they're doing? Yes, they are. If everyone's happy, no problem. So I don't think this morality rule breaks down. I never actually said that love your neighbour as yourself was a perfect rule. I remember in my first talk I said, my first statement, I said that it was a good starting point for ethics, not that it was a brilliant catch-all rule for determining how to behave. It was said that God values actions. Does that mean that if you are paralysed, you have no value? But you also said God gives ownership God gives value to the ownership of objects. He gives less value to objects that are owned than he does to living things. But you just said God values actions, and now you're saying God values objects. Well, which is it? Or perhaps it's both. Now you said, oh well, it's obvious, God gives less value, isn't it obvious that God gives less value to objects than he does to living things? But you haven't explained why he does. If God gives less value to objects because they can't feel, then you've just come up with a basis for morality that's nothing to do with God, or ultimately it's to do with more than God. It says that feelings are important. You've gone beyond just saying this is true because God said so. You've now gone outside of God. You say, well, this is true because God thinks feelings are important. So you're in a situation where you're no longer saying God is a sufficient basis for morality. If you're a dictator, you have control of a group. Well, that's true, but in order to get there, you have to be able to build successful alliances. You know, in the absence of morality, you would just get kind of chaos and nothing useful would happen. There are always going to be odd people in any society who, you know, you're going to get psychopaths, but you shouldn't have to come up with a philosophical explanation, rational explanation for that, because people aren't always rational. I mean, just as computers break down sometimes and do silly things through programming errors, people are kind of, if you think of them as being very complex machines, there's no reason why any system of ethics should be able to account for all the things that different people do. But by and large, a system of ethics should be able to account for what most people do, and most people think murder's wrong, stealing's wrong, and so on. You mentioned the little snipe I did about burqas it was related to the fact that people need to be identifiable in order to in order for certain systems of morality to work. And I quite agree with you that hoodies come under the same. And I would condemn hoodies for exactly the same reason there that I would condemn burqas. So I'm not coming up with an anti-Muslim argument, I'm coming up with an anti-concealment argument. Nothing, you know, there's nothing, not one rule for Muslims and one rule for everyone else. One rule for everyone, that's it. You quoted from the Quran about sort of killing babies. Oh, sorry, I'm out of time. You quoted from the Quran about don't kill babies because God will provide. Well, it's a fact that God doesn't usually provide, and you can't use quotes from the Quran. You can't use quotes from the Quran to convince non-believers because obviously it's not going to be any use. You have to believe in the Quran already for it to have any persuasive value. Okay, so.
Okay, again, I'm going to answer the points you've raised in his previous rebuttal. I'm going to try and get all the points he made in his last rebuttal as well, as quickly as I can. He said that gold coins aren't intrinsically valuable because on a desert island if you're starving and so on. They're intrinsically valuable, but you don't need that value at that particular time. You need the value of foodstuffs. Gold is intrinsically valuable because it has utility, it has something you can, it's something you can be used for example, for electric circuits. It's very valuable, gold, and so on. It can be used to connect electric circuits together, and many other things. It's an element, it's something that actually has a physical existence and has properties, therefore, where those properties are beneficial, this is the value it possesses. Isn't that baboons defend the weak members, so isn't that counter-evolutionary? You know what, people defend weak members generally, even in social Darwinist systems, but when there are limited resources, and you're deciding who gets the resources, then when it comes to the crunch, the weak people shouldn't get those resources over those who are strong. That's what nature and evolution says, and almost all situations. He said free will weakens the idea of determinism, and I say no. You see, free will is a component of the human being. We can choose to engage with our emotions are sometimes automatic. You walk walking down the street, it's summertime, let's say you're a guy, you see women who have exposed flesh. Whether you like it or not, whether you look away or not, you're going to have some enticement. There's going to be some enticement, some agitation, and so on. This is something you can't control. But whether you want to pursue that woman or go back home to your wife is up to your free will. What the Quran says is that in theory everyone has free will. In practice, human beings choose to exercise that free will, to not exercise their free will, and just go with what their instincts lead them, and hence they cause lots of trouble to each other. He asked, why should we make other people happy? Don't we feel happy making other people happy? Tell me, how many adulterers felt happy about, how many adulterers used this criteria before they went and committed adultery on their spouse? How many adulterers use that criteria, saying, I'm not going to cheat my spouse, that would hurt my spouse? In this day and age, we need to think about yourself, individualism. You don't care. Your happiness is your priority. You only live once, right? You only live once. So make the most of it, right? So if your spouse isn't doing it for you anymore and you have an opportunity, why not? If she doesn't know about it, then it's not sin. He said, well, we should not presume inequality, he says. And tell us an example of where's an inequality. This society is as unequal. It is a meritocracy. If you are a genius, then you have more chance of being an engineer, of being a scientist, of being what have you, than a person who has Asperger's syndrome, for example. And that's just the inequality of it. If you are someone that's more physically capable, you can and taller, you can jump higher, then you have more chance of being a basketball player than someone who's short and can't jump that high to shoot a b-ball, so to say, through the hoop, as they say. So life isn't fair. That's the famous axiom. So there's your inequality. He says that interbreeding makes us equal. Well, that's just arbitrary. Just because offspring can be produced doesn't mean you're equal. A horse and a donkey can reproduce and produce what they call a jackass, which obviously can't reproduce itself. But they can produce something. Doesn't mean it's that they're equal necessarily. Although some people say that maybe the fact that all animals can interbreed, not necessarily each other, but the fact that they can interbreed in the first place makes all people equal. And there are some animal rights activists that argue that animals and human beings are equal because we are all living organisms. So there's a problem with that. Then obviously we can't kill cows for our meat. He says that Buddhism is not theistic, it's just common sense, or what have you. Yeah? Okay, so karma and nirvana is something that atheists can believe in. So atheists can believe in karma then? No. You can't, because there's no such thing as some transcendental justice system called karma. You don't believe in that. So please, just because Buddha doesn't believe in God doesn't mean he's shooting for your side. Morals are a useful taste because morals have a use. If you're good to people, you can reproduce and you can do whatever offspring. Okay, fine. Let's say I'm homosexual. Tell me how useful that is in the evolutionary scale of things. How useful is that? Yeah, will it help me reproduce? No. No use at all, no utility at all. He mentioned some other points. Yeah, I don't have time for these other points because it's my 5 minutes up, but please ask me questions on those points and I will answer them. Thank you.
Please show your appreciation. I'm going to thank both of the speakers. Now we move on to the questions and answer session. If you have any questions.
This is to you said, why should the alpha males become more and more powerful and the weak become destroyed? And then you said later on about a contract in which why shouldn't the downtrodden send revolt? So it's something you're saying, well, both really. So there's a reason why the alphas shouldn't destroy all the weak, because then the weak will revolt against the alpha. So there's obviously some sort of equilibrium which just maintains society without God.
Good question. Well, consider this. This equilibrium can go both ways. So, for example, if a dictator is very strong, like Saddam Hussein, then nothing can oust him, and he'd remain like that until his dying day, which it kind of did. Obviously, when until outside power intervened. An alpha male, so the rule of thumb is an alpha male should get as much as what he can from society without balancing that with how much power he can have over the weak to suppress them. And of course the weak can go out and be rebellious if they have the capacity to do so. So what you're saying now is essentially that the strong can keep doing what they're doing, and they just have to be clever about it. And the weak can try to rebel if they can, but if they can't, then they have to remain suppressed or undermine society in all other ways. So again, it doesn't make for a harmonious society having that kind of materialistic calculus.
My question is to Robert. Well, if we don't require God, for morals, then we will follow their morals even if they evolve and change by time. And in this country, for instance, a few decades ago, you walking in the street in miniskirt, it's not right, it's immoral. Nowadays it's fine. Now, if those morals evolve to the level that killing disabled people is fine because scientists said, well, that will make that society function. Will you agree with this? Will you be happy because morals evolve to this level?
Am I always happy with the way morals change? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, morals change. So will you be happy if they go to an extreme like that?
No, I think I'd be happy with some changes in morality. I think there's room for improvement in the world in which we live, but I wouldn't be happy. I wouldn't be happy with all changes. No, maybe if I lived in the future and knew more than I know now, I would be happy with certain changes. But I can only speak from my current perspective, from what I know and think now, and I expect some changes I applaud and some changes I'm working for, and other changes I might not like. I don't think change in itself is a good thing, but what I do worry about is that reliance to an unchanging set of laws is potentially a very dangerous thing. And it also means that people of different religions, there's no way of reconciling the two, whereas as atheists would try and appeal to common ground, shared human values.
My question to Robert is, he said you'll be happy with morals changing, but how do you stop them from changing to that level? Because we was, our morals will stay the same from the Quran throughout time, so how do you prevent when you start the question, stop them getting to that level?
Well, I would, if I thought, I'd look at why people said they thought something was right. And if I thought that there was anything factually inaccurate in what they were saying, I would try and convince them that they are wrong. If I saw a flaw in their logic, I would point that out. So that's how I would try and change their views about what's moral.
But then how do you know what you believe is right?
Well, I think that I take quite a scientific view. Now, science has been wrong in the past, and I'm sure some of the things scientists believe now are wrong. But science demonstrates its own usefulness in a way that religions don't. There are loads of different religions in the world, and Christianity is more popular than Islam. If we were going to play the numbers game, then Christians are right and you're all wrong. So religions don't demonstrate their own utility in the way science does. Science isn't perfect, but I think as far as getting to the truth goes, consistent discovery of truth is a good criterion for discovering how useful something is for getting truth. And science has put a man on the moon. It gives us the technology we see around us. If the scientific method, if the fruits of that, if the scientific method was erased from history, we couldn't have any of the technology that's in here today. If religion was erased from history, I doubt we'd notice much difference. It doesn't give us anything that we couldn't get from non-religious sources.
Okay, so...
Can you have a question for Roberta? No, after that.
Sorry, I just wanted to rebuttal what you just said. If you're saying that, isn't it true though? Isn't it true though that a lot of scientific knowledge that has been acquired has actually come from texts like the Quran?
Well, the thing about the Quran, and I've heard Christians make similar arguments for the Bible, they take certain verses that appear to be consistent with modern science and ignore ones that aren't. For example, let's take the Bible. There's a verse in there about God spreading the universe out. And some Christian theologians would say, oh, well, this is obviously a reference to the Big Bang, the expansion of space, which has been likened to a kind of inflating balloon. But if you look at the verse in context, it's the idea that God, the term expanse in the Bible means sort of hammered out. They thought that heaven was a dome in which the heavenly bodies were embedded. They thought it was a solid structure. The Tower of Babel story, it was so close to Earth that people might build a tower and reach it. You know, what seems at first, oh yeah, that sounds quite scientific, turns out to be nothing of the kind. Now, I've seen references in the Quran. Oh, there's a wonderful description of, oh no, this might have been the Bible as well, something about how embryos were made. But there's a Bible verse that says I was formed in the depths of the earth, and there's another verse that says, you know, I was formed some other way. All kinds of poetic. If you give yourself enough poetic verses, you can find something consistent with just about anything. But what you have to do is look rigorously at all of the evidence, not just cherry pick the bits that seem to fit with scientific ideas. So there's no convincing idea that scientific foreknowledge is found in the Bible. I've seen examples in the Quran. I can't quote any, but I've seen Muslim websites. You know, the Quran's wonderful. It foretold this, this, and this. And when I've gone back and looked, it struck me that there's a simpler sort of folk explanation around at the time that it hasn't anticipated modern science. That these are coincidences.
Can you give a response to that?
Yeah.
To this particular question.
Yeah. Well, I'd say it's essentially that I think we have a lot to thank religion for. The sciences, the Renaissance in Europe, where did it come from? Cambridge University, it was Cambridge or Oxford. Where did it start off from? It started from Muslim books brought over from Spain into England, and they were started teaching it at monastery, and then it developed into university. The Muslims developed the modern scientific method as we know it, the ward system in hospitals, and many countless other things. I think if it wasn't for religion transforming backward nomadic Arabs into ones of inquisitive, progressive civilization, then we would be 500 years behind, perhaps, arguably, and than we are now. So I think that we have a lot to thank this religion for. I did actually forget the original question because you made a lot of detailed response. What was the original question, sorry?
No, the question was, I can't remember. The question was, no, it wasn't that. It was, doesn't the text like the Quran show that science has been discovered from things like the Quran, because there was, Arabic scholars that were, a major Enlightenment period before the Dark Ages, which was the Dark Ages, the European.
But I think you're referring to two things. One of them is that the Quran constantly tells human beings, constantly tells the reader, behold, look at the alternation of night and day, look at the orbits of the sun and moon, look at the laws of which the universe is bound, and then he made an analogy to the laws of God that we follow. It's an analogy between the laws of physics and the laws of these metaphysical laws that we follow. So the Quran encouraged the reader to observe the universe around it. Obviously, to see the signs of God, to see how God organizes it, how God measures it out, how God apportions it, where the portion is used. And the second, aspect I think you are referring to is that there are some verses in the Quran, for example, do not the disbelievers see that God created the universe in a single unit and then rent it asunder, or expanded it, or what have you. The word means either rent asunder, or expansion. And the other one, it says, in the same verse, it says that and this was that the heavens and the earth were all one unit. So the heavens and the earth. So the earth we're living on, and all we see everything above us, everything was one unit, and it was rent asunder. Now that's not a poetic verse. That's what it literally says in the Arabic language. Please research yourself. Don't take my word for it. Obviously, the Arab Muslim astronomers, obviously the Persians came in as well, Muslim Persians. They didn't know how to make of that verse at the time because they didn't have any way of checking it, referencing it. They went on blind faith, so that's how the universe was created. At some point in last century rather, there was a steady state theory, and all the scientists were saying everything was the way it always was, and look at your Quran, look how silly, look how wrong it got, the universe. And then when they discovered that everything's still expanding and they came with the Big Bang hypothesis, then the Muslims then had the last laugh on the steady state theorists. And the steady state theorists were the majority in the scientific community, the majority. And the person who came up with the Big Bang actually was a derisory term for the people who actually thought of it. The Big Bang was actually meant to be derisory. So it's interesting. Now, obviously, does that prove that the Quran is from God? Well, I'll leave it for you to determine. But the point I want to mention is that the Quran did encourage human beings to look at the universe and to systematically try to map it out, for obviously to appreciate the greater glory of God in His creation. Sure.
You spoke about the Renaissance discovery of Islamic knowledge. The Muslims preserved earlier Greek teachings and built on those. The first people to do science in anything like its modern form were the ancient Greeks, perhaps because their own brand of theology, they believed in polytheism, and their gods were all too human, kind of bickering, and it didn't lend itself, polytheism, to an orderly explanation of how the world works. So they began to look to nature and to philosophy to try and find their own ordered answers. Now God, and the point was made that God's a kind of divine order, and God makes the laws of physics, he makes the laws, he makes prescriptive laws of ethics. And that very idea of God as a source of order, I think, actually retarded the progress of science. We already know the source of this order, so don't bother looking for it. It was God. God did it. What causes the Earth to spin? God. Who made the Earth? God. Why are there this many planets in the solar system? God wanted it that way. As long as every question is answered with the word God, scientific inquiry is impossible. Scientific inquiry works only because we don't know the answers. You mentioned the idea of the Big Bang theory being consistent with the Quran. The Big Bang holds that space, not only that space began, but that time began. And if you have a beginning to time, you can't talk of anything causing time, or even causing the Big Bang. All talks of causation break down. So the Big Bang, far from being consistent with a theistic explanation, is actually runs contrary to it. It leaves no time in which God could do any creating. Now you could say, well, God, unlike absolutely every other single cause we know about, works outside of time. Well, if theists are allowed the luxury of saying that, atheists can say, well, the universe, unlike every other thing we know, doesn't have a cause. If Muslims can have one law for God, one law for everything else, then atheists can have one law for the universe and one law for everything else. And atheists are one level from Muslims because we know the universe exists. We both agree on that. We don't both agree that God exists. Your beliefs require more entities than my beliefs do. They're more complicated than can be justified by the evidence.
I have a quick response.
After this, then we'll just get 3 more questions. 3 more. Because of knowledge. Okay. Yes, please. Yeah, you have 1 minute.
Okay, 1 minute. All right. The Quran mentions a story where Pharaoh, in front of Moses, killed someone and said, "Look, I could kill this person. All right? I look at how powerful I am." And Moses said, "You didn't kill this person. God did." Obviously, clearly, the mechanistic process was that the Pharaoh ordered one of his soldiers to kill this person in front of Moses. But all things ultimately are determined by God. Just because God determines things doesn't mean there's a mechanistic process not at work. And we want, as Muslims, we're encouraged to look at the mechanistic process by which God brings about His will, that we appreciate the will of God. Hence, we investigated the universe to look at these mechanistic processes that we could see. And the last point he mentioned, he said that I could posit that the universe was uncreated. Well, I'll tell you what, here's my criteria. You can only say that if the universe is infinite, unchanging, and unlimited. If you can say that, if you can show that, the universe, I take your point. If you can't show that the universe, then it is created and it has a start point. And I say that God is unchanging, infinite, and independent, incontingent, and unlimited. Therefore, He is not created, but He must be the cause of everything else, because everything else being contingent, limited, and finite. That's why I say that the atheists are actually, it's more minus 1 nil, 1 whatever, than 1 nil to the atheists.
Thank you.
Can I come back on that?
Well, can I just...
Okay.
It's come to some sort of explanation from the Muslim point of view, or some moral dilemmas. For example, euthanasia and abortion. I suppose somebody was terminally ill and in great pain. What would your views be about euthanasia? Or suppose somebody's baby's going to be born with terrible defects. The thing is that from a humanistic point of view, I wouldn't say I agree with abortion or euthanasia, but at least you've got the freedom to debate the issue. Is it true that that's a closed issue in Islam? That you cannot, under any circumstances, have either euthanasia or abortion? So there's no discussion.
Well, the Islamic history, if you look at Islamic history, is famous for its debates. They debate everything, from A to Z to the kitchen sink, everything. They debate, has there been women prophets? And they discuss maybe Mary could have been a woman prophet, a female prophet, possibly, they said. Things that you wouldn't expect. They all kinds of different things they debated. Whether from things such as, whether you can use, let's say, cluster munitions, because there's a humanitarian consequence using cluster munitions on your catapults, bombarding cities. They debated those issues. Now, euthanasia and abortion is debated. It's still an ongoing debate. And I think, in fact, knowing Muslims, and perhaps even in the Jewish community as well, they're being famous for debate as well, it will never stop, the debate. And it's great that we can always constantly debate and constantly bring up what we thought was closed matters and bring them up, open them again. And it's actually what Islamic civilization is famous for. In terms of euthanasia and abortion, all I could tell you is my opinion, which I adopt from a particular jurisprudent. There are many other jurisprudents that might disagree. So if you want my personal opinion, then, for example, I would say that, well, not my personal one I derived, but I adopted from a jurisprudent. I would say that euthanasia is forbidden because it's suicide. And of course, abortion, there are exceptions. Obviously, if a woman is raped and many other issues, maybe if the woman's going to die, then various scholars have said that it's better to save the woman and the child dies, if that's unavoidable. Now, those are the situations. Now, you might ask, but what about the suffering involved? There is suffering involved. You see, suffering, I feel, is here to remind us that we're not in this earth to just enjoy ourselves. Because suffering is part of life. You have pain receptors. Nature, whether you want to call it Mother Nature or God, whatever you want to call it, saw fit to give you pain receptors, to make you be able to appreciate frustration, hatred, anger, and obviously shock, and many negative emotions. Why is that? Because surely, if nature put this there must be a reason for this. And it is part and parcel and necessary of the human existence. What is that for? I would argue it's because it's there, it helps us in our cause to worship God. But obviously an atheist might say something else, but that's my take.
Okay, now one point that was made there, that maybe the pain receptors are there so that we can appreciate the nice things. Now, an atheist called Stephen Law came up with something called the evil God challenge. The idea of a good God causes problems because, how do you square that with the suffering of evil? But you can flip all these arguments that try and justify evil on their head. You can say, well, maybe there's a really evil God that exists, in which case we have to try and justify the existence of goodness. Ugly things, good things are there so that we can truly appreciate the ugly ones. Nice things are there so that we can truly appreciate the kind of pain and suffering that an evil God wants to inflict on us. All the arguments that are used to justify the existence of a good God in the face of evil, you can flip them on their heads and say, well, God's actually really evil, in which case all the awkward good things in the world can be explained in a certain way. Whereas biologists would say that these things are around because they're useful, and utility in biology depends, it's in the eye of the beholder. If you're a sparrowhawk with good eyesight, that's very useful if you're a sparrowhawk, and not very useful if you're a sparrow. And there's not really any way around that. It's an inevitable consequence of the way nature works. But it's not something evolutionary biology has any problem with.
So one more question.
Yeah, thanks. My question is actually for both of you. Now we all know about the Nazis and the Holocaust. So my question to the atheist is, from what objective standpoint can you condemn that? Not from a subjective, personal standpoint. And to the Muslim, what's your basis for condemning the Holocaust? What actually makes it wrong? So I think that can sum up the entire debate, this question. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think it's wrong because I could justify, I couldn't. Objectively, it's difficult. I say I think it's wrong, but I can justify why I think it's wrong in terms of sort of useful adaptations. You know, it's not useful having to be killed. I tend to think of other people along the same lines as myself. It's only the sort of demonization of other people, you get in-group, out-group sort of mentality that dehumanizes people, that allows these terrible situations to occur. And religion is very good at bringing those things about. So I don't know if I can tell you objectively why it's wrong. Subjectively, I feel it's wrong, but the fact that it's subjective doesn't mean it's arbitrary. You know, people all across the world feel murder is wrong, and they feel it for very useful Darwinian reasons. So, as I say, even if I can't justify something objectively, that doesn't mean that it is arbitrary. Whereas if you justify something by saying because God said it's wrong, it does become arbitrary, as Plato's argument showed.
Well, the condemnation of the Holocaust rests on a very objective basis, which is killing innocent human life is wrong. But I want to go into the mind of the Nazi. I'm going to the mind of the Nazi. What was the Nazi thinking? What was a lot of the German people thinking at the time? You see, yes, most people agree that killing is wrong, even the German, even the Nazi. But what the difference between us and the Nazi is that the Nazi believed that the Jews were a threat to the German society. They were a fifth column. It's much like what far-right people think Muslims are now. We are the new Jews, so to speak, in Europe. So in the Nazi Germany, when they would make cartoons about Jews and when they would demonize the Jews and people complain, they would say, you're against my freedom of speech because I'm trying to exercise my freedom of speech to defend this society from an insidious threat, which was in their mind, in their warped mind, the Jews. So for them, they did, these were normal Germans, they weren't all psychopaths, normal Germans who would, pat their dog on the head and play with their children and so on. Hitler was very nice with children, he was very nice with his family. But in his warped mind, he saw the Jews as being subversive, and so he did the natural, what you call the materialistically natural thing, which is to eliminate the threat as he saw it. And this is being invoked even today. I've seen people, quote-unquote normal people even, saying that Muslims are a threat in the West and they should be dealt with. Some of them don't go to talk about what they mean by dealt with. Some do. They just said get rid of the Muslims, kill them, eliminate them, and they're even open about it. Even, Nick Griffin, in that, the Question Time, he laid into Islam, and everyone took issue with everything else he said, except what he said about Muslims and Islam. Isn't that interesting? It's funny how the social hysteria can make people commit immoral actions, whereas there are Christians and Jews who say, even if they agree, and they say, well, yeah, Muslims might be a detriment to society, but we must always hold ourselves to a higher standard. Those people who have an absolute basis, an objective basis, will never fall foul of the social whims of the mob mentality, that is, the subjective morality of people who just follow what society says. And I will say this, in this last point about God. You see, God, like the Bank of England, okay, I know it's a bit of an analogy here, it's a bit of an analogy here. If you're an economist, you probably view it like that. But anyway, the Bank of England, because it's a recognised authority, people will say, whenever the Bank of England says it's legal tender, you will say it's legal tender. You will use this currency. Everyone will use this currency because the Bank of England has the final say. Much like the dictionary has a final say. If I debate with him as to what word means something, maybe this word means something to me. Maybe I believe the word gay means happy. He believes the word gay means homosexual, and we argue about this. We say, look, we can resolve this. We go dictionary. What does dictionary say? That's an objective basis. This is something that's been put there, and this is what God is. God is a transcendent, infinite, and eternal criterion to determine the value of actions, intentions, and objects as well. Everything. God determines the value of everything, and this is from this basis that we can objectively right now say the Holocaust is bad then, it's bad now, and it was bad in the future. Thanks.
Okay, well,
Just one minute, this is really good.
Okay, well, I would say that Hitler invoked religion several times in his speeches. He said, I'm called as a Christian to fight against the Jewish poison. Now, he might not have been a Christian, he might have been putting it on for the crowds, but that just shows how easy it is to use religious ideas to further all kinds of nasty views. Now, maybe if people were a bit more critical of religion, those kind of things wouldn't have happened. This shows the danger of religion. And Hitler was actually a deeply superstitious person. He wasn't a rational person at all.
Would you like to?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I thought that was it.
No.
All right, okay, yeah.
Dr. Stoffel will make his final concluding remarks.
Okay, to sum up, I don't think my criticisms of religion have been answered. The religious basis of morality. I still haven't had a response for why living things have more value than insensitive objects. I still haven't had an answer to where God got his moral values from and why he deserves credit for being good, given he's always been good and never acquired goodness. To me, the idea of God is just unnecessarily complicated. It was said earlier in his closing remarks, it was said that gold is intrinsically useful. It's useful because it has intrinsic properties that make it useful. In other words, he justified the worth of something by the fact that it was useful, which is precisely what I did when I invoked evolutionary theory as a basis for ethics. And the utility of something depends on its environment. Generally speaking, you don't think of a stone as useful, but if you were to smash a window and there's no other object around, then a stone might be quite useful. The utility of something isn't a property of an object itself, it depends on the environment you're in. This is a relativistic idea, the idea that God somehow furnishes something with a purpose. Purpose can be discovered. The first artificial sweetener, the saccharin, was discovered by someone filling around in a lab with an industrial chemical. The idea that purpose has to come from God is falsified by that kind of chance discovery. There's no necessary reason. God doesn't, if we see a purpose in something, purpose can be discovered, it doesn't have to be built in. I think that it's a very dangerous thing to couple religion to morality. You saw in the example of the Nazi Germany, the rhetoric that was used to whip up the Germans, who actually say were normal people. The stage had been set for the persecution of the Jews by centuries of Christian persecution of Jews. Jews, after all, allegedly the Christ killers. There's that verse in the Bible that says something along the lines of, and his blood will be on all of our children, meaning the Jewish race, which is, of course, a terrible thing to do and to say, and it's bound to lead to situations where Jews are going to be, there's going to be prejudice against Jews. An analogy was made that the ultimate source We need a sort of ultimate source of morality, namely God, in order to work out what's right and wrong. Just as we need an ultimate source for what language means. Does the word gay mean happy, or does it mean homosexual? Let's go to a dictionary and find out. Well, I'll tell you something interesting about dictionaries. If you went to an old dictionary, you wouldn't find that the word gay meant homosexual. You'd find it only meant happy. Languages change. Dictionaries, when people invent new words, sometimes just one person invents it, and it takes off, it becomes popular. Languages evolve. And words come into our language because they're frequently used. The word spam used to refer to a type of tinned meat, and now it's probably more often used to refer to unwanted emails. Now, you see here that the meaning of a word isn't somehow built into the word itself. It's determined by its usage. It changes over time. It's not some intrinsic quality. So I think that the idea that things have some intrinsic quality given by God is falsified by the fact that language evolves, dictionaries evolve. They're not ultimate authorities. The meanings of words have changed in the past. People's ideas about what are right and wrong are changing. There have been some, many constants actually. We were told how wonderful and open the debates have been in Islamic societies about, for example, abortion and euthanasia. You can't have it both ways. You can't say on the one hand there have been wonderful open debates within the Muslim community about how these things are, and on the other hand say that religion provides a useful guide to morality. If religion provides a useful guide to morality, then there'd be no need for debates about these subjects. People would always agree on the answers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Now,
all right, I'm going to try and answer all the points which I couldn't answer in my last rebuttal as quickly as I can. Basically, he said the rhetoric of Nazi Germany was religious. Check your history. It's actually nationalistic. It was. They said that they complained about a great stab in the back, that the Jews were behind supporting the Allies in World War I, which is obviously, I suppose he meant the Zionists giving money to the British Empire, which was partly true. But then he said that basically the Jews were international, they only cared about themselves, and they were detrimental to the German nationalism. German nationalism was the basis. It wasn't religion. If you use religious rhetoric to this very day, maybe I'm ignorant, but this very day I've never heard of Hitler's religious rhetoric. He probably used it, but 95% he used was secular rhetoric, much like the BNP use against Muslims today. They don't, sometimes they say it's a Christian country, but they're a secular party in themselves. He said that my analogy of gold, said gold is useful, shows that I believe in utility. No, I was using an analogy that a materialist could understand. I wasn't saying that that's my theory of value. He also said that it's something good because God says so, and that anything can be good if God says so. Firstly, it's kind of like this. A manual for how to use, let's say, your computer is good because it allows you to fulfill the purpose of the computer. The computer was made to fulfill the purpose. And so the manual, which will guide you how to fulfill that purpose, will appear to you to be good. One could argue, is the manual good because merely the creator of the computer says so? Or is the manual good because it actually fulfills the purpose? Well, the point is both. Because God says something is good, and He designed us to almost sense or appreciate His guidance as good. We will feel fulfilled by following our purpose. And that's what we sense as good, so it would appear as good to us. He said that human beings were not designed well because God is a poor designer because we seem to do a lot of bad things. Well, you see, we were designed to be individuals that have free will and to exercise our free will. That was our purpose. Our purpose was to exercise our free will. And in that, God was a success. God was successful. He created us to be perfectly imperfect and perfectly us. What God doesn't desire us to be perfect humans, perfect beings, because that would be unfair. God designed us to try to worship Him for the best we can, even despite our faults. But that's a bigger discussion. We can have a lot of time. He said that language changes and the dictionary changes. Dictionaries change. That's true. But do you know what? I'll tell you the ultimate objective basis behind all language. Do you know what it is? It's objects. Or whatever culture you go for, you call an orange, laranja, or you want to call it orange, whatever word you want to use, or portugal in Arabic, whatever word you want to use, it's the same object. That's the absolute basis. The objective basis behind language is objects. There's your absolute basis, my friend. Now, he said that he would love to be ravished by beautiful women who want to have sex with him. Well, I hope he's meaning in an allegorical way, analogous. It doesn't matter. Sometimes you desire something that you can't have. And you would want them to treat you as you'd love to treat them, for example. It doesn't make it, you can't add a caveat to that when there is no caveat for human desire. So again, you can't show us why a human should do something contrary to their desires, if of course it is beneficial to their desires. He said that God values actions, but it's only God values life because of feelings. Is it because life has feelings and so on? Is that why? Well, look, God values feelings because God values feelings, and He gave it a high proportion. That is, you're right, it is arbitrary, but God being absolute can afford to be arbitrary. See, God, yes, what God decides is good or bad, you could say is arbitrary in a way, but because He's absolute, it's an absolute basis. So is subjective arbitrary better than objective arbitrariness? No. He said in his previous point, he said that if you're a dictator, you still need morality to gain power. Ever heard of narcissists? I'll leave you to research that. People aren't always rational, he said in his thing. Then why do you expect God's commands to be irrational then? To make sense, to have a basis outside of God, which we can say this is the reason for utility or for what have you. Sometimes God says something and it fulfills human needs, and that's how it is. There's nothing more to it. He says burgers need people to be identifiable. I'll get people being identifiable. I could say wearing drag outfits. What about people communicating via telephone, radio, book writers? You can fall in love with an author and you've never met the author before. You see, or what about people on the internet? You don't even meet the person face to face a lot of the time. And of course, my last point is, he says, when the Quran promises not to bury your children alive if you're poor, because God will provide, this is a false basis. He's justifying why an atheist maybe should do that. But you see, we need religion to make us do moral actions, even if they are counterintuitive to the material world that we perceive. Even if they're counterintuitive, that is the whole point. Religion is there to make us not do those bad things, because bad things, a lot of those bad things are beneficial. That's why people do bad things in the first place, because they benefit them. So we need religion to tell people that this might be counterintuitive to your self-interest in this world, but don't do this bad thing. Anyway, I think that pretty much sums up my entire presentation for today. Thank you.
I couldn't understand everything what was said today. I didn't. Please put your hands together again, final time. If you have any questions, please do approach the speaker. They will be here. And don't forget to have some drinks, refreshments on outside. Jazakallah khair. Subject to guidance.